A world between shores, before the Viking Age, before long ships carved wakes across oceans. The north of Europe was a frontier. It was not yet the stage of legend, but a world of isolation. Harsh winters, rugged coastlines, endless forests. Scandinavia lay at the edge of the known world, a land outsiders barely understood, and its own people had only begun to master. The geography of Scandinavia was both prison and teacher. Mountains split the land into narrow valleys, where communities were scattered and often cut off from each other. Fjords deep, jagged scars carved by glaciers provided both protection and passage. For centuries, travel was slow. Paths wound through forests thick with pine and birch. Rivers froze in winter. Seas stormed in autumn. To survive here was to bend to the rhythm of nature. But this land, cold and unforgiving, also forged resilience. In the soil, hard to plow but fertile when worked, grew grains that sustained families. In the water swam cod, herring, and salmon. Deer and elk roamed forests. Walrus ivory, amber, and furs became treasure resources that one day would draw the attention of far-off worlds. While Rome rose and fell to the south, Scandinavia was watching. Traders brought whispers of empires, of wealth, of faiths, unlike their own. Yet the North remained apart. In Denmark, in Sweden, in Norway, small tribes and petty kings ruled. Their power was local, fragile, and bound by kinship. A chieftain might command 50 farms, or 500. Alliances shifted, feuds burned, and violence was common. But distance also offered freedom. Where empires taxed and ruled, the North remained untamed. Its people lived by their own customs, laws spoken at the Thing. Honor kept by oath, stories remembered by religion bound the people to their world. Pagan rituals honored gods who were both protectors and destroyers. The gods were not distant figures on high thrones. They walked among men, flawed, cunning, fierce. Odin, the seeker of wisdom, gave his eye to drink from Mimi as well. Thor's hammer shook the skies with thunder, defending mankind against giants. Freya blessed the harvest. Freya welcomed the slain. The Norse believed they lived in a cosmos of many realms. Asgard, Midgard, Heli. These were not abstract myths. They explained the cycles of nature, the cruelty of winter, the hope of spring. Every storm, every harvest, every victory and defeat was woven into this spiritual fabric. But their faith carried a shadow. Unlike the eternal heavens of Christianity or Islam, the Norse believed even the gods would one day die. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was inevitable. This belief in an ending shaped their courage. If fate is unchangeable, then the only freedom is in how one meets it. As the early medieval world shifted, the North began to stir. Climate patterns offered slightly warmer years, bringing population growth. Villages became larger, halls richer, chiefs more ambitious. The longship, first used for fishing and local travel, grew more advanced. Builders experimented with new designs, lighter hulls, flexible planking, stronger keels. These ships could glide through shallow rivers, yet withstand the open ocean. A new generation looked outward. They had tailies of silver in the east, fertile lands. To the west, soft monasteries filled with treasure, and cities far to the south, richer than any hall of the north. And so the horizon, once a wall of waves, became a door. In the year 700, Europe was changing. In the west, the old Roman Empire was gone, leaving behind kingdoms of Franks, Saxons, and Celts. In the south, the Byzantine Empire stood tall, a jewel of wealth and learning. In the east, the Abbasid Caliphate was rising, with cities of dazzling brilliance: Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba. All of them would soon hear the echo of oars against water, but none of them yet knew. To them, the north was distant, its people barbaric, forgotten. To the north itself, the world beyond was legend, rumor, opportunity. The age of quiet isolation was ending. The age of movement, of exchange, of violence and discovery was about to begin. This is the threshold of the Viking Age, a world between shores, a people forged by frost and fire, by hunger and honor, by gods and fate. Soon, their ships will break across the seas. Soon, their names will be carved into the memory of nations. But for now, the North still waits. Long before the Vikings set sail across the known world, they lived in lands carved by ice and stone. Scandinavia, harsh, cold, and unforgiving, was a crucible. Out of its mountains, fjords, and dense forests arose a people shaped by survival. This was not yet the age of raiders and explorers. It was the age of farmers, herders, craftsmen, and storytellers. It was here, in the north, that the Viking spirit was born. Imagine a village of no more than a few dozen wooden homes. Smoke rises from turf-roofed holes, where families gather around a central fire. Outside, sheep and cattle graze in small enclosures, guarded from wolves and winter storms. Life was simple, but never easy. The Vikings were first and foremost farmers. Barley, rye, and oats were grown in narrow fields carved out of the earth. In the warmer months, fishing boats pushed out into fjords to bring in herring and cod. Every family relied on this cycle: plant, harvest, fish, hunt, survive. Winter was the great enemy. Food was stored in pits and barns, dried fish and meat smoked over open flames. Children helped tend animals. Women wove cloth. Men repaired tools and weapons. Every hand had a task, for in this land, idleness was dangerous. Family bound Viking society together. Lineage was not just blood, it was status. It was honor. To belong to a strong family was to be protected. To lose that honor was to be cut adrift. In these sagas, we read of feuds that lasted generations, sparked by insults, broken promises, or debts unpaid. Honor demanded vengeance, but it also demanded loyalty. A man's word was as strong as his sword. Women, too, held influence. They managed households, oversaw farms, and in some cases, even traveled and traded. Their role was not silent submission, but partnership in survival. But survival was not just physical. The Vikings lived in a world infused with myth and magic. They believed the world was held together by Yggdrasil, the great tree, whose roots reached into realms of gods, giants, and the dead. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, traded his eye for wisdom. Thor, the thunderer, defended mankind with his hammer. Freya, goddess of love and war, guided the fallen into her hall. Life and death were not separated by fear, but by fate. To die in battle might grant entrance to Valhalla, where warriors feasted eternally. Yet, even the gods were not eternal. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, was coming. A belief that even the mightiest would fall gave the Norse a unique courage. If all things must end, then what matters most is how you face that ending. Despite the image of bloodthirsty raiders, the Vikings valued law and order, at least among themselves. They practiced an early form of democracy through assemblies known as the Thing. Here, free men gathered to settle disputes, judge crimes, and decide on matters of trade or war. These meetings were held in open fields, beneath the sky, often near sacred sites. The law was spoken aloud, remembered, and passed down through generations. It was imperfect, of course. The wealthy and powerful held more sway. Slave thralls had no voice, yet the Thing was a foundation of governance, a reminder that even in harsh times, people sought justice. And yet, it was the sea that defined them. The Vikings were children of the water. From childhood, they learned to read tides, winds, and stars. Their most remarkable achievement was the longship. Sleek, light, and deadly fast. Carved from oak, fitted with overlapping planks, powered by both sail and oar. The longship could cross oceans or slip into shallow rivers. This gave the Norse an unparalleled advantage. They could appear where no army expected them, vanishing just as swiftly. But beyond warfare, the ship was a lifeline of trade and exploration. Without it, there would have been no Viking Age. Legend speaks of sunstone's crystals that could locate the sun even on cloudy days. Whether myth or truth, Viking navigation was advanced enough to carry them to lands no European had ever seen. Knowledge was preserved not in books, but in memory. Skalds, poets, were the keepers of history. They recited sagas that told of ancestors, battles, and gods. Around the fire, these stories wove identity, binding the community to the past. To forget was to vanish. To be remembered was to live forever. In the north, on the edge of the known world, a people learned to endure. Their lives were a balance of struggle and celebration, hardship and honor. And as their ships grew stronger, as their stories grew bolder, the horizons themselves began to call. The Viking Age was about to begin. The North was awakening. The North had long been a land of frost, stone, and isolation. Scandinavian valleys were scattered with farms and villages. Rivers froze in winter, and the forests were thick with elk and wolves. Yet the people of the North were restless, their eyes always on the horizon. By the 8th century, longships had evolved beyond fishing vessels and local transports, lighter, faster, and flexible enough for shallow rivers or open seas. They promised not just survival but adventure. The western seas called to them, England's coasts, Ireland's monasteries, the rich lands of Francia. It was the beginning of an age that would be remembered as the Viking Age. The year was 793. On Lindis, a small island monastery off the coast of Northumbria, monks labored in quiet devotion. Manuscripts were copied by candlelight. Relics were polished and venerated. Without warning, longships appeared. Norse raiders leaped ashore, axes and swords in hand. They plundered treasures, killed or enslaved monks, and vanished as quickly as they came. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded, "This year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria. The harrying of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. For the Norse, it was opportunity. For the English, an apocalypse. This raid would be the first of many along the western coasts. The Cuverdale hoard, buried in England around contained thousands of silver coins from Anglo-Saxon lands, Islamic dirhams, and Scandinavian jewelry. It demonstrates the complex trade and raiding network that the Vikings had begun to establish. By the mid-9th century, raiding had escalated into conquest. The great heathen army, a coalition of Norse warriors, swept across England. Unlike earlier raids, this was organized warfare. York, renamed Dorvek, became a major Viking settlement. Archaeology reveals streets of wooden houses, workshops, and a thriving economy. Leather goods, jewelry, and tools testified to daily life amid conquest. Ireland also fell under Norse influence. Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford grew as Viking hubs, connecting the north to international trade, from the Islamic world to the British Isles. The sagas tell of Ragnar Lothbrok, whose exploits reached legendary status. He raided Paris and Northumbria, eventually dying in a pit of serpents. His sons Bjorn, Ironside, Ivar the Boneless Sigurd, Sneckendile, led the great heathen army in vengeance. The sons of Ragnar would not leave their father's enemies alive. One saga recounts, the land would quake beneath their feet and the rivers run red. Whether literal or legendary, these tales capture the Norse mindset. Bravery, honor, and destiny were inseparable. Over time, raiders became settlers. The Norse established permanent communities in England and Ireland. They intermarried with locals, adopted agricultural practices, and built towns. Language absorbed Norse wordski, egg, law. Window isle art fused Celtic knotwork with Norse animal motifs. Everyday life reflected a cultural crossroads where violence and settlement coexisted. Runestones in England and Ireland commemorate Norsemen who died abroad. Some bear inscriptions in Old Norse, others in local scripts, illustrating the blending of traditions. Not all legacy was peaceful. Dublin became one of Europe's largest slave markets. Captives from Ireland, Wales, and further afield were sold locally or shipped east for trade. Slavery provided silver, wealth, and labor. It was a dark thread in the Viking expansion, demonstrating that commerce and conquest were deeply intertwined. The westward push did not stop at Ireland or England. Norse explorers sailed to the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, where settlers established farms and one of the world's earliest parliaments. From Iceland, they voyaged to Greenland, and finally, Vinland, the shores of North America. Saga accounts tell of timber forests and grapes. Those settlements were temporary. These journeys showed the Vikings' daring and mastery of navigation long before Columbus. In Dublin, York, and other hubs, Norsemen traded furs, silver, honey, and slaves for goods from France, the Islamic world, and beyond. Coins, jewelry, and artifacts reveal a cosmopolitan society. Hybrid artistic styles emerged. Celtic knotwork, combined with Norse animal designs, Viking crosses alongside Christian icons. Words, customs, and families blended into new hybrid identities. Expansion was not peaceful. Raiding continued alongside diplomacy. treaties with local rulers, marriages with local families, and service as mercenaries became common. The Norse were pragmatic raiders when necessary, traders when profitable, settlers when opportunity arose. Their flexibility enabled them to dominate regions far from Scandinavia. The Western Seas reshaped the Norse identity. From raiders of monasteries to settlers, merchants, and lawmakers, the Vikings wove themselves into the social and cultural fabric of England, Ireland, and Iceland. The horizon had expanded, but the world was bigger still. To the east, rivers carried the promise of gold, silk, and empires older than the north itself. The Viking Age had only just begun. The west had been conquered by longships and axes, but the east offered a different promise. Rivers flowing into the heart of empires, cities paved with stone and coin, and cultures older and richer than Scandinavia itself. The Varangians Norsemen of the East would navigate these waterways, becoming traders, warriors, settlers, and rulers. They would shape the lands of Russia and Ukraine, protect emperors, and forge legacies that would endure for centuries. The eastern horizons were vast, mysterious, and beckoning. The Vikings, ever restless, answered the call. Picture a longship gliding down the Volkhov River. Its oars dip silently into the water. The banks are thick with pine and birch. Wolves cry in the distance. Every bend of the river brings new danger. Rapids, ambushes, and unpredictable currents. These waterways were highways for the Vikings. They linked the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, opening a path to Constantinople and the Islamic world beyond. Vikings hauled ships over portages, navigated treacherous rapids, and established temporary winter camps along the riverbanks. At Styria, Ladoga, and Novgorod, archaeologists have found Scandinavian-style burials, rune-inscribed objects, jewelry, and household tools evidence that Norsemen were not just raiders, but settlers and administrators. The primary chronicle, compiled centuries later, tells a story of invitation and settlement. Slavic tribes plagued by internal conflict called upon Varangian leaders to bring order. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order. Come and reign over us. Rurik accepted, establishing his base at his successors Solag, Igor, and Sviatoslav moved south along the Dnieper, seizing Kiev and founding the Kievan Rus. Archaeological evidence confirms the presence of Scandinavian architecture, weapons, and jewelry blended with Slavic culture, illustrating how the Norse became both rulers and integrators. The Rus identity was born of fusion, Scandinavian warriors and settlers adapting to Slavic customs, while spreading their own language, art, and technology. The rivers carried more than warriors. They carried wealth. Hordes of silver coinstarums from the Abbasid Caliphate, Byzantine coins, and locally minted currency have been found in Scandinavia, evidencing trade across thousands of miles. Furs, honey, wax, and slaves traveled south. Silver, silk, and luxury goods traveled north. The east became a corridor of commerce, connecting north and south, pagan and Christian, riverbank settlements to imperial capitals. Artifacts such as jewelry, weights, scales, and imported textiles show that trade was both practical and cultural, introducing Norsemen to foreign art, ideas, and technology. One of the most vivid accounts of the Vikings in the East comes from Ahmad ibn, an Arab diplomat sent to the Volga Bulgars in 921 CE. He describes the Rus traders and warriors in astonishing detail. I have never seen more perfect physical specimens tall as palm trees. Fair and ruddy, they wear cloaks covering one shoulder, carry axes and swords, and are fearsome in battle. He witnessed a Viking funeral where a chieftain and his female slave were burned together on a ship. The girl sang, drank wine, and was sacrificed in ritual honor. Ibn Fadan was horrified. But for the Varangians, this was the ultimate act of devotion and passage to the afterlife. His account provides invaluable insight into Viking customs, beliefs, and ritual practices in the East. Under leaders like Oleg and Igor, Kiev flourished. The city became the heart of Kievan Rus, linking Scandinavia to Constantinople via the Dnieper River, the legendary route from the Varangians to Zegriks. Kiev and other settlements became centers of administration, trade, and military power. Scandinavian settlers adapted to Slavic law, governance, and religion, while retaining their own traditions. Saga accounts recount Oleg nailing his shield to the gates of Constantinople, a symbolic act of ambition and diplomacy. The Varangians were both feared warriors and respected emissaries. Archaeological finds include Scandinavian-style swords, imported Byzantine silks, Islamic coins, and jewelry. Burial sites show a mixture of Norse and Slavic rites, illustrating cultural blending at the personal and societal level. The Byzantines recognized the skill and loyalty of northern warriors. They recruited them as the Varangian Guard elite, bodyguards of the emperor. They wielded massive two-handed axes, wore protective gear, and were renowned for fighting until death. Chroniclers noted that the Guards' loyalty was unmatched. They defended emperors, enforced imperial law, and participated in campaigns across the Mediterranean. Harald Sigurdsson, later King Harald Hardrada of Norway, served in the Guard. He fought in Sicily, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, acquiring wealth and prestige before returning to Scandinavia. Service in Byzantium offered not only riches, but a new understanding of foreign empires, politics, and military tactics. The East was not just a corridor of trade and warfare. It was a melting pot. The Vikings encountered Slavs, Finns, Bulgars, and Byzantines. They adopted foreign motifs in jewelry, clothing, and weaponry. Old Norse inscriptions appear alongside Greek and Christianity began to take root among some Norse settlers, blending with old pagan beliefs. Archaeological evidence shows crosses and Thor's hammers buried together, suggesting gradual cultural and religious integration. Even language absorbed foreign influence. Old Norse terms entered Slavic dialects, and vice versa. The East was a living laboratory of cultural synthesis. Excavations at Novgorod, Kiev, and Staraya Ladoga reveal hybrid artifacts. Scandinavian swords, repaired with Middle Eastern steel, jewelry, combining Norse and Slavic designs, household items reflecting local and imported styles, dirham hoards, tres, trade to Baghdad, and beyond. Byzantine coins indicate diplomatic and military service. Runestones commemorate those who traveled east, bridging legend and reality. Stories were told of men who died with the Greeks, far from home yet honored. Sagas describe chieftains navigating rivers, defeating rivals, negotiating with Slavic princes, and gaining wealth in Constantinople. In one tale, a Varangian prince battles local raiders, secures tribute from Kiev, and returns to the north with silver, furs, and fame. These stories preserved memory, valorized adventure, and inspired new generations to venture east. Trade was not only in silver and spices. Slavery was integral to Eastern commerce. Captives from Slavic lands were sold locally or exported along the rivers. Slaves were a source of labor, status, and wealth. Their presence reminds us that while the Vikings were explorers, traders, and rulers, they were also participants in systems of exploitation and human suffering. The East exposed Norsemen to Christianity and Islam. Some converted, others adapted symbols into syncretic practices. Diplomacy was equally important. Treaties, marriages, and alliances allowed the Varangians to govern multi-ethnic populations. They were raiders, but also diplomats and administrators, learning to navigate complex political landscapes. By the 11th century, the Viking presence in the East was no longer purely Scandinavian. Families, dynasties, and cultures had blended into the Rus identity. Yet the legacy of exploration, trade, and martial skill endured. Rivers that once carried raiders now carried merchants, diplomats, and emissaries. The Varangians had transformed the eastern horizons into a bridge between north and south. Pagan and Christian, riverbank villages, and imperial capitals. The eastern rivers reshaped the Vikings. They were no longer simply raiders, they were settlers, rulers, traders, and guards. They left their mark on Novgorod, Kiev, and Constantinople, blending cultures, building economies, and forging legacies. The Viking Age had stretched far beyond the north, east and west rivers and seas. Trade and conquest, they had become a global people before the world had even imagined it. And yet, beyond these horizons lay the southern seas, where the Vikings would meet empires older than Scandinavia itself, and cultures even richer than those they had known. The western winds had carried the Norse to the British Isles, to Ireland, even to the edges of Iceland and Greenland. But their eyes did not stop there. Southward lay warmer waters, lands of bustling cities, sprawling empires, and cultures older and more complex than anything in the north. From the rocky coasts of Iberia to the golden domes of Sicily, the Vikings' longships would traverse seas they had never imagined. Here, they would meet the Islamic world, the remnants of Rome, and kingdoms rich with trade and culture. This is the story of the Vikings in the southern seas of raiders, traders, mercenaries, and cultural intermediaries. In the late 9th century, Viking raiders began appearing along the coasts of Spain, Portugal, and southern France. Unlike the remote monasteries of England, these lands were urbanized, fortified, and influenced by centuries of Roman and Islamic culture. Yet, the Vikings' longships allowed them to strike swiftly and vanish before armies could respond. In 844, a Viking fleet reached the Andalusian coast of Iberia, attacking Seville. Chroniclers wrote of their speed and ferocity. They plundered, took Captibus, and then melded into the estuaries. For Muslim chroniclers, these northerners were called Al-Barba barbarians from the north, strange men with pale skin and fiery hair, wielding axes that could split shields and timber alike. Legend tells of Viking mercenaries hired to seize Luna, a city near Pisa, in the late 10th century. According to the sagas, a band of northern warriors, far from home, navigated rivers, fought local forces, and demanded tribute. Archaeologists have found Scandinavian-style weapons and artifacts in southern Italy dating to this period. Swords, even jewelry fashioned in Norse designs. These traces hint that Vikings were not just raiders but also soldiers for hire, integrating into Mediterranean conflicts. Raiding was only the beginning. The southern seas opened new avenues for trade. In Sicily, which oscillated between Byzantine, Arab, and later Norman control, Vikings found markets overflowing with spices, silks, and gold. Ember from Scandinavia traveled south in exchange for fine textiles, coins, and exotic goods. Jewelry from this period shows hybrid motifs, Norse interlacing patterns alongside Arabic inscriptions. Even everyday objects, spindle whorls, combs, and metalwork reflect a fusion of northern and Mediterranean styles. The Sicilian hoard, unearthed near Palermo, contained dirhams from the Islamic world, Byzantine coins, and objects unmistakably Scandinavian. This hoard demonstrates the Vikings' rich not just across Europe, but into the heart of the Mediterranean trade network. Not all Vikings came as raiders. Some arrived as mercenaries, drawn by wealth and opportunity. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Norse warriors fought in Sicily and southern Italy for local rulers. The Byzantines, too, employed them as soldiers in campaigns against Arabs and rebellious cities. Saga accounts describe these warriors: tall, fair-skinned men, carrying axes and spears, sometimes riding into battle on horses unfamiliar to the north. Their reputation for ferocity preceded them, and their loyalty often outlasted that of other mercenaries. The Vikings. Pojechisto landolista. Muslim-ruled Iberian Peninsula exposed them to a culture far more sophisticated than they had known. Cities like Cordoba and Seville dazzled with their architecture, libraries, and wealth. In Cordoba alone, the great mosque housed thousands of manuscripts on science, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Norse raiders and traders may not have understood every text, but they carried back silver coins, textiles, and even knowledge in subtle ways. Islamic coins, especially silver dirhams, were highly prized in Scandinavia, forming the backbone of Viking trade networks. Here, in the south, the Norse first encountered a civilization that challenged the notion of barbarism, teaching that wealth could be generated not only through violence, but also through commerce and craft. One saga tells of Harald, a Viking captain from Norway, who sailed south to the Mediterranean. He and his crew raided along the coasts of Spain, capturing ships, securing tribute, and occasionally engaging as mercenaries for local lords. The saga describes him walking through marketplaces filled with spices, olives, and textiles unknown in the north. Merchants spoke in strange tongues, coins bore unfamiliar scripts, and the architecture towered above the rooftops of Viking towns. It was a world both terrifying and alluring, where fortune and danger walked hand in hand. Sicily was a prize of opportunity, situated between the Mediterranean and the Adriatic. It was a crossroads of Byzantine, Arab, and eventually Norman power. Norse mercenaries and traders established footholds in the island cities, sometimes serving local rulers as bodyguards or soldiers. Archaeological finds include Norse weaponry alongside Byzantine ceramics, illustrating the blending of cultures. Coins, rings, and even fragments of clothing show that Norsemen adapted to local life, adopting some customs while maintaining their own traditions. Trade routes from Sicily connected to the broader Mediterranean network, enabling goods from Spain, North Africa, and the Levant to flow north to Scandinavia. The Vikings ventured even further south. North African coasts, modern-day Morocco, Tunisia, and Algiers occasionally felt the presence of northern raiders or traders. Reports describe Viking ships along Mediterranean rivers, engaging with Berber traders, raiding small settlements, and navigating unfamiliar tides and winds. While rare, these interactions reveal that Viking exploration was not limited to Europe. They were observers, adapters, and sometimes participants in distant cultures, leaving small but measurable traces in archaeology and history. Objects recovered from southern Viking expeditions tell a story of hybridity. Deramun hordes from Iberia and Sicily highlight trade with the Islamic world. Weapons axes, swords, spears show. Scandinavian craftsmanship, often repaired with foreign metals. Jewelry combines Norse knotwork with Arabic calligraphy or Byzantine motifs. Even everyday items, spindle whorls, combs, and ceramics reveal adaptations to southern lifestyles. The Norse were not isolated raiders. They were participants in a complex web of exchange. The South introduced Vikings to new faiths, while many retained Norse pagan beliefs. Encounters with Christianity and Islam exposed them to powerful religious systems. Some Norse converted to Christianity during their campaigns or trading ventures, particularly in Sicily and southern Italy. Others incorporated foreign religious symbols alongside Thor's hammer, a testament to adaptation and syncretism. This blending of traditions foreshadowed the ways Viking culture would continue to evolve, influencing the regions they settled in while absorbing elements of the lands they encountered. The southern seas revealed a Viking world unlike any before. It was a world of wealth and war, of trade and terror, of cultural exchange and adaptation. From Iberia to Sicily, from the Berber coast to Byzantine ports, the Norse left their mark and carried back lessons. Coins, textiles, and stories that would echo across Scandinavia. The South was not only a horizon to rid, it was a crossroads, a place where the Vikings, for all their reputation as raiders, became merchants, soldiers, and agents of cultural exchange. And while the Mediterranean sun warmed their ships and cities, a new horizon still awaited. The clash of faiths and empires in the east, where the Vikings would meet Byzantium Islam and the rich civilizations of trade along rivers and seas. The journey south had reshaped them, and the world would never be the same. Scandinavia was a land of gods and giants, of sacred groves and fiery ritual. The Vikings worshipped Odin, Thor, and Freya, and each village, fjord, and valley held a sacred story. But as the 10th century unfolded, the tides of belief began to shift. From distant lands came new gods and new faiths, Christianity, flowing north from England, Francia, and the Holy Roman Empire. Trade, marriage, and conquest brought missionaries, relics, and pressure to convert. This chapter explores the meeting of faiths, how pagan Scandinavia confronted Christianity, how belief shaped politics and identity, and how a new spiritual era emerged amid fire, steel, and ritual. Before Christian influence, Scandinavian society was organized around kinship, honor, and religious obligation. Gods were ever present in daily life. Thor's hammer protected homes. Odin guided warriors. Freya ensured fertility of the land. Rituals were intimate and communal. Sacred groves and standing stones marked holy sites. Scandinavians' offerings of food, weapons, and animals were given to gods, often accompanied by song, poetry, and blood sacrifice. The Norse sagas preserve glimpses of these practices. One tale recounts a chieftain sacrificing a prized stallion to ensure victory in battle, while another describes a winter festival where villagers offered mead to spirits of the forest to bless the harvest. Religion was inseparable from survival. Archaeology confirms this vivid religiosity. Thor's hammer amulets, carved runestones, and ceremonial swords found in graves illustrate devotion and belief in divine protection. Temples, like the one at Uppsala in southern Sweden, reveal longhouses dedicated to worship, often layered over centuries of construction. Christianity first reached Scandinavia through trade, diplomacy, and raiding. English monks, Frankish missionaries, and returning Vikings brought knowledge of the new faith northward. Early Christian settlements often began at trading posts or royal courts where kings could engage with powerful continental allies. The spread was gradual. It was not yet a force of mass conversion. Christianity coexisted with traditional pagan practices for decades, creating a layered spiritual landscape. Legend tells of King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who received missionaries and relics from the Holy Roman Empire. His initial adoption of Christianity was both political and spiritual, a tool to unify his people and strengthen ties with powerful neighbors. Missionaries played a crucial role in Christianizing the North. Monks, bishops, and priests traveled into remote valleys, often risking hostility and violence. T preached, built churches, and translated scripture into local dialects. Missionaries like Ansgar, the Apostle of the North, traveled to Sweden in the 9th century, establishing the first Christian communities. While he faced skepticism and resistance, small footholds of faith were planted in trading hubs and royal courts. Conversion was not merely spiritual, it was political. Kings used Christian alliances to consolidate power, gain legitimacy, and access continental trade networks. Faith and governance became intertwined. Christianity did not arrive peacefully. Pagan priests and local chieftains resisted foreign gods, fearing loss of power and identity. Sacred groves were sites of protests. Old rituals were performed defiantly in the open. Some sagas recount dramatic confrontations, villagers destroying Christian symbols, priests fleeing, and kings forced to choose between tradition and the new order. Yet over time, political pragmatism and social pressure eroded resistance. Pagan practices were gradually absorbed into Christian festivals or reinterpreted through the lens of new beliefs. Graves from the transition period show fascinating hybridity. Pagan burial rites, with Christian symbols, Thor's hammer placed alongside crosses. These artifacts illustrate the tension and eventual blending of religious identities. Kings were pivotal in shaping religious landscapes. Conversion often began at the top. Rulers adopting Christianity could unify their people and legitimize their reign. Harald Bluetooth famously declared Christianity the official faith of Denmark in the late 10th century, erecting runestones, celebrating both kingship and the new religion. Similarly, Olaf Tryggvason in Norway used a combination of persuasion, gifts, and intimidation to convert chieftains and local populations. sometimes destroying pagan temples in the process. Christianity offered not just spiritual authority, but also diplomatic leverage. Alliances with England, the Holy Roman Empire, and France became possible for Christianized rulers. Conversion was rarely immediate or absolute. Pagan and Christian beliefs coexisted, merged, and adapted. Thor's hammer motifs persisted alongside crosses. Seasonal festivals Surignale, honoring gods of fertility and harvest, were repurposed as Christian celebrations. Poetry, sagas, and oral tradition continued to reference gods and heroes, now woven into Christian morality tales. This syncretism allowed communities to retain cultural continuity while adopting a new spiritual framework. Religious identity became layered, reflecting both old and new beliefs. The construction of churches marked the tangible presence of Christianity. Early wooden churches appeared in trading centers like Hidibi, Burka, and Rib. Monastic settlements became hubs of learning, literacy, and art. These institutions preserved knowledge, created manuscripts, and trained clergy who could communicate with continental Europe. Through architecture and scholarship, Christianity reshaped Scandinavian society, linking it culturally and economically to the broader Christian world. Excavations at Burka reveal a range of objects cross-pendants, imported wine, amphorae, liturgical items, and Christian inscriptions alongside traditional Norse artifacts. This demonstrates both the religious and economic integration of the North into Christendom. Conversion impacted law, social hierarchy, and daily life. Pagan customs were gradually replaced by Christian moral codes. Legal codes began to reflect biblical principles. Marriage, inheritance, and governance were increasingly influenced by Christian norms. Literacy and record-keeping spread through church administration. The adoption of Christianity also facilitated Scandinavia's participation in continental politics and trade, accelerating societal transformation. Despite official conversion, pagan practices lingered, especially in rural areas. Archaeological evidence shows ritual deposits, amulets, and symbolic burials continuing into the 11th century. Sagas recount pockets of resistance, chieftains performing sacrifices in secret, villages secretly honoring old gods, and even clashes between Christian and pagan communities. These episodes illustrate that conversion was a process, often uneven and contested, rather than an immediate or total shift. Religion also affected gender roles. Pagan women often acted as priestesses, seers, and caretakers of sacred rituals. With Christianization, new religious roles emerged: nuns, abbesses, and female patrons of monks. Some women became key agents of conversion, marrying Christian kings or supporting monastic foundations. This shift illustrates the intersection of faith, gender, and power in Viking society, highlighting how religious change permeated every aspect of life. Christianity influenced Viking art, poetry, and saga literature. Runestones began to feature crosses. Illuminated manuscripts and Christian symbols entered traditional Norse motifs. Sagas began to incorporate moral lessons, often blending pagan heroics with Christian values. The resulting literature preserved Viking identity while reflecting the changing spiritual landscape. Artifacts, like carved wooden panels, jewelry, and manuscripts, reveal the depth of this cultural synthesis. By the 11th century, Scandinavia was increasingly integrated into the Christian world, pilgrimages to holy sites, participation in continental crusades, and diplomatic correspondence with other Christian rulers became common. The Viking Age had produced raiders, traders, and explorers. Christianization transformed them into citizens of a broader European society. The North was no longer isolated, it was connected through faith, law, and shared culture. Grave sites, churches, and settlements from this period provide a window into the religious transition. Burial mounds with both pagan rites and Christian crosses, cross pendants buried alongside swords and Thor's hammer amulets. Churches built atop former pagan sacred sites. These findings illustrate a gradual, layered shift rather than abrupt change, where old traditions were neither erased nor ignored but absorbed into new practices. The meeting of faiths transformed Scandinavia politically, socially, and spiritually. Pagan practices survived in folklore and ritual, while Christianity provided a framework for law, governance, and international diplomacy. By the late Viking Age, kings, merchants, and farmers navigated a world where old gods and new faiths coexisted, creating a uniquely Scandinavian synthesis. This religious evolution would shape society for centuries, influencing art, law, trade, and identity. The encounter between paganism and Christianity was not a simple story of conquest or replacement. It was a dialogue, a negotiation, a gradual blending of beliefs, values, and practices. The Vikings, who had traveled west to Ireland and east to the rivers of Rus, now faced a different kind of frontier. The spiritual horizon. In embracing, resisting, and transforming faith, they reshaped their world, leaving a legacy that would endure in Scandinavia's art, law, and culture for centuries to come. The age of gods and men, of ritual and scripture, was now fully intertwined, and yet new horizons awaited. Crusades, continental integration, and the slow march toward medieval Europe. The story of faith in the Viking Age was far from over. The Viking Age is remembered for swords and raids, but behind every warrior stood a merchant. Behind every plundered monastery, a bustling market. The true power of the Norse was not only forged by steel, but by silver, salt, furs, and silk. From Greenland to Baghdad, Viking traders carried goods, ideas, and technologies across continents. Their ships were not only weapons of war, but vessels of exchange, connecting distant cultures in ways few could imagine. This chapter explores the vast web of Viking trade networks, the cultural exchanges they fostered, and how commerce shaped the destiny of Scandinavia. Popular imagination paints Vikings as raiders, yet raiding was only part of their economy. Trade was essential. Even within Scandinavia, markets and seasonal fairs were centers of exchange where farmers, smiths, and merchants gathered. Markets like Hedeby in Denmark, Rib on the Jutland coast, and Birka in Sweden became hubs of international commerce. Here, furs from the north met silver from the Abbasid Caliphate, while slaves, weapons, and textiles moved through bustling stalls. The term Viking itself, while associated with raiding, also referred to seafaring expeditions, many of which had commercial motives. What did the Vikings trade? Scandinavia's resources were unique and in demand across Europe and beyond. Furs and skins, Arctic fox, marten bear, and beaver pelts were prized luxuries, traded as far as Constantinople and Baghdad. Walrus ibori harvested from Greenland, used for chess pieces, jewelry, and religious artifacts in Europe. Amber, fossilized resin from the Baltic, carved into ornaments since antiquity. Iron and weapons. Scandinavian smiths were renowned for their steel, producing swords, spears, and tools that traveled widely. Slaves, one of the most controversial commodities, with captives from raids sold in markets stretching to the Middle East. Timber, fish, and meat. Everyday staples that fed both armies and empires. Excavations at Hidden uncovered warehouses filled with imported glassware, Frankish wine, and even Arabic silver dirhams, evidence of global trade flowing through Viking ports. The backbone of Viking commerce was silver. Vast quantities flowed into Scandinavia from the east, particularly from the Abbasid Caliphate. Arab silver dirhams, minted in places like Samarkand and Baghdad, flooded Viking markets. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of these coins across Sweden and Russia, often cut into pieces for use as boot. The dirham trade reveals how Viking merchants linked the Islamic world with Europe, transporting silver northward through rivers, forests, and steppe routes. This silver became the economic lifeblood of Scandinavia, fueling expansion and wealth. Nowhere is Viking commerce more impressive than in the east. Swedish Vikings, known as the Russ, carved trade routes along the great rivers of Rushtha, Dnieper, and Volga, slipped through forests and marshes, portaging overland when rivers failed. These routes connected the Baltic to the Black Sea and Caspian, opening pathways to Constantinople and the Islamic world. The Rus founded trading settlements such as Novgorod and Kiev, which would later grow into powerful states. Arab chroniclers describe Vikings on these river stole, fair-haired traders selling furs, honey, and slaves in exchange for silk, spices, and silver. The century account by Ahmad Ibn Fadlan recounts his meeting with the Rus along the Volga. He describes their ships, rituals, and trade practices in vivid detail, marveling at their wealth and exotic customs. For Vikings, Constantinople, known as Miklagard, the great city, was the crown jewel of trade. Byzantine markets offered silk, wine, gold, and luxury goods unparalleled in the north. In return, the Byzantines valued the Vikings' furs, timber, and iron, as well as their service as mercenaries. The famed Varangian Guard, composed of Norse warriors, became the emperor's elite bodyguard. These warriors often returned to Scandinavia with Byzantine wealth, coins, and relics, further enriching their homelands. Cultural exchange was profound. Viking art began to incorporate Byzantine motifs, and stories of the marvels of Constantinople entered Norse sagas. To the west, Viking trade intertwined with raids. Monasteries plundered in England often yielded gold, manuscripts, and relics. Yet over time, Vikings transitioned from raiders to settlers and traders. In Ireland, Viking-founded towns such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick became vital trade centers. Dublin, in particular, flourished as a hub for silver, slaves, and textiles, linking Scandinavia to the Irish Sea and beyond. In Francia, Viking raids gave way to treaties, granting lands such as Normandy in exchange for peace and trade. This blending of raiding and commerce illustrates the Vikings' adaptability. Warriors on one voyage, merchants on the next. Beyond Europe, Viking traders expanded across the Atlantic. Greenland provided walrus ivory, sought after in Europe. Iceland supplied wool, fish, and falcons, prized for hunting. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland, likely Newfoundland, suggests that Viking exploration reached North America, though large-scale trade never took root. Still, the Atlantic colonies expanded the reach of Viking commerce, demonstrating their unparalleled seafaring ability. Central to Viking trade was the human commodity. Slaves, or thralls, captured in raids across Britain, Ireland, and Slavic lands. Thralls were sold in markets from Dublin to Baghdad. Slavery fueled Viking economies, providing labor for farms, households, and even export. Accounts describe long slave caravans moving eastward along the rivers of the Rus, bound for Islamic markets where demand for slaves was high. Though abhorrent today, slavery was deeply woven into the Viking economy, a stark reminder of the brutality underlying their prosperity. Trade was never just about objects. It carried ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across continents. From Byzantium, Vikings adopted artistic styles, coinage systems, and religious relics. From the Islamic world, they encountered advanced mathematics, medicine, and new trade systems. From the West, they absorbed Christian symbols, manuscripts, and political structures. In return, Viking culture influenced others. Norse fashion, shipbuilding techniques, and mythologies spread widely. The sagas themselves contain echoes of stories drawn from distant lands. Archaeological discoveries bring Viking trade to life. Silver hoards buried in fields across Scandinavia reveal the wealth of merchants. Exotic goods such as Chinese silk fragments found in Swedish graves showed the extraordinary reach of trade routes. Runestones commemorate merchants lost on journeys to the east. One famous inscription reads, "He died in Sörkland," a Norse term for Muslim lands. These stones are silent testimonies to the dangers and rewards of Viking commerce. Trade transformed Scandinavia's landscape. Settlements such as Hidivi, Barkakopang, and Jorvekjort grew into urban centers. Streets, workshops, and wharves bustled with life. Craftsmen produced goods for export: beads, combs, jewelry, and weapons. Foreign merchants established quarters in these towns, creating multicultural communities where languages and customs mingled. These towns were the engines of the Viking economy, precursors to the medieval cities of Scandinavia. What was life like for a Viking merchant? Unlike warriors seeking glory in battle, merchants pursued wealth through patience, risk, and negotiation. A trading voyage could last months or years, facing storms, pirates, and hostile locals. Yet the rewards were immense. A single journey to Byzantium could return a fortune in silk and silver. Merchants became influential figures, funding expeditions, supporting kings, and shaping the flow of goods that sustained society. By the late 11th century, Viking trade networks began to decline. As Scandinavia Christianized and integrated into European feudal systems, raiding diminished and commerce became regulated by monarchies and the church. New trade routes, dominated by Hanseatic merchants and continental powers, shifted economic control away from Viking towns. Yet the legacy of Viking trade endured in urban growth, cultural blending, and the integration of Scandinavia into Europe's economic sphere. The Viking trade networks were among the earliest examples of globalization. They linked the Arctic to the Mediterranean, the North Sea to the Caspian, and even touched North America. These exchanges reshaped economies, societies, and cultures, leaving a lasting imprint. The silver hoards, runestones, and sagas are reminders of a time when Scandinavians were not just raiders of the world, but its connectors. Behind every Viking sword was a scale. Behind every raid, a ledger. Trade and commerce were as vital as battle and blood. The Norse did not only carve their legacy with axes, but with contracts, coins, and cultural exchange. In their ships, the world came closer together. And in their markets, a new age of connection began, one that set the stage for medieval Europe's global encounters. Long before kings ruled from castles and crowns glimmered in candlelight, law in the north was spoken under open skies. No thrones, no courts, just men and women standing in a ring of stones, speaking truth and judgment aloud. This was the Viking thing. The heart of Norse society, a place where disputes were settled, alliances forged, and justice carried out in the presence of the gods. In this chapter, we journey into the world of Viking law and governance, where words could weigh more than swords, and honor was currency stronger than silver. The Viking world was not lawless. Despite their fearsome image, Norse societies valued order deeply. Law was the bond that held the scattered farms and fjord communities together. Unlike many of their medieval contemporaries, the Vikings had no centralized monarchy during most of their history. Power was distributed among chieftains, clans, and assemblies. Decisions were made collectively, not decreed from a throne. This decentralized structure gave rise to one of the earliest forms of participatory governance in Europe, a system built on consensus, reputation, and collective memory. At the center of this system stood the Thing. Every region, whether in Norway, Denmark, or Iceland, had its own assembly where free men gathered to make decisions, pass judgments, and settle disputes. The Thing was both a court and a parliament. Disputes over land, inheritance, or blood vengeance were brought before it. Laws were recited aloud by the law speaker, the keeper of memory and justice. In Iceland, the Althing, established around 930 CE, became one of the oldest continuous parliaments in the world. Representatives from across the island gathered each summer at Thingvellir, the assembly plains, to debate, feast, and forge the laws that governed their society. The law speaker, Orelegis, Kumaere. Kumaere was a revered figure. In a world without written codes, the law existed in his memory. He stood upon a rock, staff in hand, and recited from memory the laws that guided the people. Each year, a third of the code was spoken aloud, ensuring it was never forgotten. He did not rule, he reminded. His authority came from knowledge, not power. The law speaker symbolized the Norse belief that law belonged to all, no to rulers. Justice was a shared burden, and memory itself was sacred. Oaths were the backbone of Norse law. In a world without written contracts, a man's word was binding. Breaking an oath could destroy reputations, sever alliances, or invite vengeance. To swear falsely was not only shameful, it risked divine retribution from Odin and Thor, gods of wisdom and order. Honor Draenscaper defined a person's worth. It was measured not by wealth, but by reliability, courage, and fairness. A man who broke his word lost his standing. His name, his kenning, would be spoken with scorn. Viking justice was rooted in balance. When blood was spilled, it demanded redress. Not necessarily by more blood, but through compensation. This system, known as wargeld, literally man price, set a value on every life according to status. If a man was killed, his family could demand payment rather than vengeance. But if the killer refused, followed, families could be locked in generations of retaliation. Saga literature overflows with these cycles. Tales where a single insult spirals into decades of retribution. He struck him down with his axe. Then the kin of the fallen rose and swore upon the gods, "We shall not rest until his death is answered in kind." This brutal equilibrium maintained social order. It was not chaos. It was balance through consequence. Women in Viking society held more legal power than in many contemporary cultures. They could own property, request divorce, and inherit land. A woman wronged could bring her case before the thing. In the sagas, women are not silent figures. They act as plaintiffs, witnesses, and instigators of justice. A wife might demand compensation for her husband's death, or even call upon her kin to avenge an insult. This legal autonomy reflected a society shaped by harsh realities. Survival in the North demanded fairness between genders, for crimes too grave to forgive. The thing imposed out to be declared an outlaw skoganga, meaning to go into the forest, was to lose all legal protection. Anyone could kill you without punishment. You could not own land, speak at assemblies, or receive aid. Outlawry was both punishment and purification, removing those who broke society's trust. The Icelandic sagas are filled with tragic figures cast into exile. Men like Grettir the Strong, doomed to wander the wild until death. Their fates embodied the Norse fear of dishonor above all else. As centuries passed, the old communal systems began to change. Chieftains grew stronger. Wealth from raids and trade concentrated power into fewer hands. By the 10th and 11th centuries, kingdoms emerged. Harald Fairhair in Norway, Gaum the Old in Denmark, and Olaf Tryggvason. Among them, these rulers began codifying law, transforming oral customs into royal decrees. The thing did not disappear, but its autonomy waned. Justice became an instrument of the crown. With conversion to Christianity came profound legal change. The Church introduced written law codes, moral prohibitions, and concepts of divine judgment. Blasphemy, heresy, and witchcraft became crimes alongside theft and murder. Yet the Norse spirit of negotiation and community endured. In many places, Christian and pagan laws merged. Oaths, now sworn on the Bible instead of Thor's hammer, but still binding in spirit. Viking trials were elaborate rituals. Witnesses were summoned, oaths sworn, and ordeals performed to test truth. One common method was the hot iron ordeal. The accused would grasp a heated blade. If the wound healed cleanly, the gods had judged him innocent. Though primitive by modern standards, such trials reflected a profound belief in divine justice. That truth revealed itself through fate, not argument. Law in the Viking world was not separate from life. It was woven into every feast, every marriage, every oath of friendship. The thing was also a festival. People brought goods to trade, sang poems, and renewed bonds. Justice and joy existed side by side. Even disputes could be settled through marriage or the exchange of gifts. The Norse understood that peace, not victory, was the truest end of law. The Icelandic sagas preserved countless cases of law and justice, not as dry records, but as human drama. In Ungel Saga, a burned farmhouse becomes the site of moral reckoning. In Laxt, La Saga feud over inheritance consumes generations. These stories were more than entertainment. They were moral lessons, living law remembered through storytelling. To hear them was to understand the boundaries of right and wrong. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of thing sites across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Stone circles, mounds, and wooden benches marked places where law once lived. In Iceland's Thingvellir, the assembly plains still echo with the past. Visitors can walk between cliffs where the law speaker once stood, his voice carried by the wind. These landscapes were sacred, not because of temples, but because of truth spoken there. To the Vikings, justice was not about punishment. It was about restoration. Even vengeance had purpose. It reaffirmed balance. Mercy was not weakness, but wisdom. A man's worth lay in his integrity, not his strength. The ideal judge was one who maintained peace, not one who triumphed in battle. In their rugged world, fairness was survival. Every oath, every verdict, every assembly ensured that chaos stayed just beyond the edge of the firelight. In the Viking world, law was not written on parchment, but carried in the heart. It lived in memory, in oaths, and in the shared trust that bound people together. Where kings ruled by decree, the Norse ruled by consensus. Their laws did more than govern, they united. The circle of stones may have fallen silent, but its spirit endures in every parliament, every courtroom, every word spoken in the name of justice. For even the fiercest of warriors knew, a society without law is a ship without a rudder, lost to the tides. The final voyage, every life ends with a journey, and for the Vikings, that journey was sacred. They did not believe death to be an end, but a crossing, a voyage from one shore to another, from Midgard, the realm of men, into the unseen world beyond. Here, in this final part of their spiritual world, we step into the mists that separate the living from the dead, and into the eternal echo of their faith. Archaeology has uncovered their beliefs in the earth itself, in burial mounds and ship graves scattered from Denmark to Iceland. We glimpse the Viking imagination made real. The dead were not buried in silence. They were sent off, sometimes burned a pyre upon a ship, set alight so that flame and smoke could carry the spirit skyward. Other times laid within the earth, surrounded by treasures, food, and weapons for the next life. At Aseberg, 2 women were buried together in a magnificent longship beneath a mound of clay and turf. Their grave held silks from the east, carved sleighs, animals, and tapestries. Objects both practical and symbolic. At Birka, a warrior was buried with sword, shield, and horses, long believed to be male, but DNA proved the warrior was female. Even in death, the boundaries of gender, power, and faith were fluid. Each burial told a story, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. The afterlife was not one single place, but many, each reflecting how a person lived and died. The most famous was Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where warriors chosen by Valkyries fought by day and feasted by night, awaiting wrath. But this was not the only destiny. Half the slain went to Freya's hall, Folkvangor, where peace and love ruled eternal. Others traveled to Helheim beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, a quiet, misty realm for those who died of age or sickness. In Some Thalis, the sea claimed its own. Drowned sailors dwelling in the hall of Ran, the sea goddess, who gathered them in her net. For the Vikings, the afterlife was not punishment or reward. It was continuation, a reflection of life's deeds and the natural balance of existence. Death was a communal act. It bound families, neighbors, and generations together. A funeral was not only grief, it was transformation. The body was dressed carefully, adorned with jewelry, weapons, or tools. Offerings were made. Ale was poured onto the ground to invite the ancestors to share the feast. And when the fire burned or the mound was sealed, the living spoke the names of the dead, again and again, until the sound faded into silence. Because to forget a name was the truest death. Every saga begins with lineage. Who fathered whom? What deeds they did? Where they fell? Memory was sacred. To be remembered was to live eternally in the web of word. Across Scandinavia, the landscape itself was a temple. Mountains, rivers, stones, and trees were alive with spirit, each a threshold between this world and the next. At Gamla Uppsala in Sweden stood one of the most revered sanctuaries. Chronicles describe golden idols of Odin, Thor, and Freyr standing before a great hall. Every 9 years, people gathered for the BLT, a sacred festival of sacrifice. Animals, and sometimes humans, were offered, their blood sprinkled upon the idols and the trees. It was not cruelty, but exchanged life given to life, a pattern of reciprocity older than memory. Other sacred sites were quieter. A single standing stone on a windswept hill, a grove where offerings of silver were buried in roots, a waterfall where people whispered wishes into the roar. No priests needed to stand between mortal and God. The land itself was the altar. BLT simply meant sacrifice, but its meaning ran deeper, to strengthen the bonds between worlds. There were many kinds: seasonal blots marking harvest or winter's return, victory blots before battle or void, personal blots seeking healing or protection. A feast followed every sacrifice, meat roasted over open fire, meat shared, songs sung, life and death mingled in the smoke. In some accounts, the chieftain served as both political and spiritual leader. The Gogi, he was not a priest in the modern sense, but a mediator between people and gods. Faith was not a profession, it was a responsibility. As the Viking world expanded to Britain, Ireland, France, and beyond, so too did their contact with Christianity. At first, the cross was just another symbol among many. Traders and warriors adopted it as charm or a token. Thor's hammer and the Christian cross were sometimes worn together, each invoking protection from different powers. But in time, the old balance began to shift. Missionaries arrived with new scriptures. Kings forged alliances through baptism, and the gods of the north began to fade into myth. The process was not swift. It took centuries. In Iceland, the conversion was settled not by war, but by debate at the Althing. In the year 1000, leaders agreed to accept Christianity as the public faith. But quietly, people continued to sacrifice to the old gods in private. Thus began the age of two faiths, the cross and the hammer sharing the same sky. Conversion did not erase the old religion. It transformed it. Folk traditions kept the memory alive. Blessings with water mirrored ancient sprinkling rituals. Feast days of saints replaced festivals for Thor or Freyr. Processions for fertility and harvest carried echoes of pagan offerings. In remote valleys, farmers still carved runes upon beams for luck. Fishermen still poured ale into the sea before sailing. The church could baptize the people, but it could not drain the spirit from the land. Even the Norse myths survived. Not as scripture, but as story. The poetic Edda in prose. Edda, written by Christian scribes like Snorri Sturluson, preserved the voices of gods long after their altars were gone. What was once religion became poetry. What was once belief became memory. But memory in the North was immortal. To call Norse belief paganism misses its heart. It was a philosophy of courage, a way of seeing existence as struggle, fleeting but meaningful. In the Viking worldview, the cosmos was doomed. Even the gods would fall. But that did not lead to despair. It led to defiance. Odin knows he will die at Rag. Thor knows the serpent. Jarmungandor will kill him. Yet they fight anyway. This was the ultimate virtue, to act nobly in a doomed world. To meet the inevitable not with surrender, but with song. The Vikings' spiritual vision never vanished. It evolved. Their myths shaped centuries of northern art, poetry, and philosophy. Their gods lingered in language itself. Tuesday for Tyr, god of justice. Wednesday for Odin, the seeker. Thursday for Thor, the protector. Friday for Freya, goddess of love. Even modern Scandinavian landscapes carry echoes of the old faith. Hills named for Thor, springs dedicated to Freyr, stones carved with serpents of eternity. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the old religion was reborn through scholarship and imagination. Today, thousands practice Azitro, a modern revival honoring the gods of the North, not through blood, but through remembrance. To stand beneath a northern sky, to hear the wind move through pine and frost, Istufhellet, the living thread that binds the present to the past. The Vikings never separated life from spirit. To live was to worship. To remember was to pray. The world the Vikings knew is gone. Their temples are ruins. Their gods remembered in whispers and words. Yet the rhythm of their faith still beats beneath the surface. The courage to face the dark. The reverence for the earth. The belief that every ending carries a seed of beginning. They saw existence not as something to escape, but something to embrace. Fierce, cold, beautiful, and perhaps in the quiet spaces of the world, where the wind moves through birch and stone, they still listen, those old gods, those old souls, waiting for the next verse of the endless song. The spiritual world of the Vikings in the Viking Age. Death was not a void, it was a bojaka. The soul, setting sail beyond the edge of the known world. The living stood as witnesses at the shore of eternity, preparing the traveler for their last crossing. The sound of waves mingled with the rhythm of prayer. The scent of pine tar and fire filled the air. Every funeral was a story, every ritual a bridge, linking the mortal to the divine. When the great ship of Oseberg was unearthed in 1904, it revealed one of the most breathtaking funerary monuments in human history. Two women laid to rest within a carved wooden ship, surrounded by artifacts that spoke of both power and devotion. Tapestries, animal heads, a chariot, and silks from distant lands. Their bodies rested as though sleeping, faces turned toward the bow, ready to depart on their eternal journey. This was no mere burial. It was a passage. A ship was not just transportation. It was a vessel of the soul. The prow, curving toward the sky, became a symbol of transcendence, of leaving one realm for another. Elsewhere in Scandinavia, funerary traditions varied. Some were grand and royal, others humble and private. The dead might be burned on open pyres, the flames consuming both body and possessions, sending smoke spiraling into the sky, a messenger between worlds. Ashes were gathered and buried in urns, or scattered in sacred groves. Others rested in ship graves, covered with stones and earth, their mounds rising like islands in the landscape. Every element had meaning: the direction of the burial, the placement of weapons, the food offered beside the body. To the Vikings, these gestures were not superstition. They were communication. The living spoke through ritual, ensuring the dead would not wander lost. The Viking cosmos was vast, not just one heaven and one hell, but 9 worlds, woven together by the roots and branches of Yggdrasil, the great world tree. When death came, the soul did not simply vanish. It journeyed toward the realm that reflected its life. Warriors who died bravely in battle might be chosen by Odin, carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla, where eternal glory awaited. There, in Odin's hall, they would feast on the flesh of the boars, drink endless mead from the goat Eirin, and fight again each dawn. Training for Ragnarok, the final battle. Yet not all heroes belonged to Odin. Half of the fallen went to Freya, goddess of love and war. In her field of Folkvanger, a gentler afterlife, where the brave rested in beauty and calm. For those who died not in combat but through sickness or age, there was Helheim, ruled by the goddess Hel. Far from the fiery hells of later Christian imagination, Helheim was cold, gray, and still, a land of mist and memory, where the dead existed in quiet reflection. Sailors lost to the sea were said to join Ran, the sea goddess, in her watery hall beneath the waves. And for the most honored dead kings, jarls, poets, there was a belief in reincarnation, the return of the soul through the family line, reborn in a grandchild or kin. The afterlife, for the Vikings, was not about punishment or reward. It was continuity, a natural cycle of return. Each soul found the realm that matched its essence. When death came, the community moved as one. The body was washed, sometimes by women known as Disir, attendants of fate. It was dressed in fine garments, tunics, cloaks, belts, brooches. Weapons were laid beside men, tools and jewelry beside women. The grave goods told stories of what mattered most in life and what might be needed beyond. Sometimes, animals were slaughtered and placed at the side of the dead horses to ride into the next world. Dogs for loyalty, oxen for sustenance. There are tallies, grim, yet sacred, of slaves or companions who volunteered to follow their master. One of the most detailed accounts of such a ritual comes from Ahmad Ibn, who in 921 CE witnessed a funeral among the Rus Vikings on the Volga River. He wrote, "They burned him in a ship. I saw with my own eyes the smoke rising like a dark storm. They drank and sang until the flames died. The ship became ashes, and the wind carried the soul to the sky. For the Norse, this was not despair, it was reverence. Death was not defeat, it was transformation. To the Vikings, the divine was not confined to temples or priests. The world itself was alive with presence. Forests, mountains, waterfalls, all were imbued with vidir, the spirits of place. Farmers left offerings of milk or ale at stones or trees, asking for good harvests or protection. In Norway's valleys, legends spoke of Huldufólk, hidden people who lived beneath hills. Disturbing their dwellings could bring misfortune, but honoring them brought peace. At Gamla, Uppsala, in Sweden, a sacred center of Norse worship, great mounds still rise. Burial places of legendary kings, and possibly the site of massive religious gatherings. Adam of Bremen, a chronicler from the 11th century, described what he had heard of the temple there. Golden idols of Odin, Thor, and Freyr, each representing war, thunder, and fertility. Every 9 years, people from across Sweden came to sacrifice animals, and it was said, even men, to renew the world's balance. Though Christian scribes often exaggerated such dailies, archaeology suggests great festivals and ritual gatherings did occur. But unlike the Christian cathedrals that came later, Viking spirituality did not depend on walls or clergy. Their temples were the skies themselves. Their altars were the fields that fed them. Among all rituals, none embodied Viking faith more completely than the BLT, a sacrifice of gratitude and renewal. The word BLT comes from a root meaning to strengthen, to worship, to nourish. It was a moment when the world's invisible fabric was rewoven. Gods, ancestors, and humans, bound again through shared offering. At the heart of the BLT stood the animal sacrifice. A goat, boar, or horse would be offered, and its blood collected in a wooden bowl called a hlot. Priests or chieftains, known as gogar, used twigs or bundles of spruce to sprinkle the blood upon altars, idols, and participants. This act was symbolic, a sharing of life force. The gods gave their energy to the world. Humans returned a portion in gratitude. Then came the feast, joyous, loud, and alive. Meat roasted on spits, mead flowed freely, and songs filled the hall. Each toast, or sumbel, followed a sacred order. The first to Odin or Thor, the second to the ancestors, the third to personal vows, or to those who had fallen. In the flicker of the firelight, promises were spoken, oaths sealed. To break an oath sworn during a BLT was to invite misfortune from gods and men alike. The BLT was not cruelty or bloodlust. It was balance, an exchange, ensuring that the harmony of life, death, and nature endured. The fire that once forged a people begins to fade. The world grows colder, and somewhere between myth and memory, the gods fall silent. For the Norse, the universe was not an endless line. It was a circle, a cycle of creation, destruction, and renewal. To them, the world was born from the clash of fire and ice, and someday it would die the same way. This belief shaped everything. How they lived, how they fought, even how they dreamed. In the Viking mind, nothing lasted forever. Not kings, not warriors, not even gods. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods was never meant to frighten. It was a mirror, reflecting the truth every Viking knew, that even the strongest must one day fall. The story of Ragnarok comes to us from the poetic Edda, a collection of Norse poems preserved after Christianity reached the north. Among them is the Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress. In it, a wise woman, ancient beyond time, speaks to Odin, the All-Father. She tells of how the world began and how it will end, how gods, giants, and men will meet their fate beneath a burning sky. She describes the first signs: a winter without end, a sun that grows dim, and a world divided, brother fighting brother, kin against kin. These were not just omens of divine apocalypse. They were reflections of human experience. In the Viking Age, famine, endless war, and bitter cold were not metaphors they were alive. The word Fimbulvator, the great winter, carried a chill that was more than physical. It was the fear of losing everything that made life possible in the north. Imagine 3 winters without summer, crops withering, herds dying, ships trapped in frozen seas. For people whose lives depended on the rhythm of seasons, that wasn't myth, it was memory. The saga's endless frost might well have been inspired by real events. Volcanic eruptions that darkened the sky, failed harvests across Scandinavia, and the long shadow of hunger that left its mark on every generation. When the sagas speak of the world freezing, the Vikings understood, because for them it already had. In Asgard, even the gods cannot escape fate. Odin knows his doom, swallowed by the wolf Fenrir. Thor will strike down the serpent Jomangandor, but die from its venom. Freyr will fall to fire, weaponless. These are not tales of cowardice or punishment. They are hymns to courage. For the Vikings, bravery was not surviving. It was standing tall when survival was impossible. Every man, woman, and god was bound by word, the woven thread of destiny. And if that thread ended in flame, then so be it. What mattered was how one faced it. Odin's wisdom was bought with sacrifice. He traded his eye for sight, his comfort for knowledge, and he used it to prepare for an end. He knew he could not stop. That is the paradox of the Norse spirit. Knowing defeat is certain, but fighting anyway. Beneath the surface of myth, Ragnarok was a reflection of fear. Not of creatures, but of chaos itself. The wolf Fenrir, the serpent Jormungandr, and the fire giant Surtur. Each represented forces the Vikings could not control. Nature's hunger, the ocean's rage, the wildfire's destruction. In an age where the sea could swallow ships and volcanoes could blot out the sun, these monsters were symbols of the untamable world. And yet, in the Norse vision, even chaos had its place. Destruction was part of creation. The world ended not because of evil, but because that is how the cycle turns. At the center of the Norse cosmos stood Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting all realms. Asgard, Midgard, and the underworld. When the end approached, Yggdrasil shook. Its branches cracked. Its roots bled. This was more than a vision. It was the Norse way of expressing the collapse of order itself. To the Vikings, the world was balanced like a ship at sea. When the gods faltered, when men abandoned honor, when nature turned on them, that balance tipped. Ragnarok wasn't only about gods dying. It was about the structure of meaning itself falling apart. Every culture projects its fears into its stories, and the Vikings were no different. When we hear of Ragnarok, we're also hearing echoes of the Viking Age itself, nearing its twilight. By the late 10th century, Christianity had begun to spread through the north. Old gods were fading, replaced by new promises of eternal life. Temples to Odin and Thor fell silent. To many Norse people, it must have felt as though the end of their world had already begun. Ragnarok wasn't just prophecy. It was happening socially, spiritually, and politically. Even as new faiths took root, the Norse vision persisted, not in defiance, but in adaptation. They believed the cycle would continue. If gods could fall, perhaps new ones would rise. If old worlds burned, new worlds would bloom. In the myth, as flames devour the world, gods and monsters meet on the field called It stretches 100 leagues in every direction. The battlefield of destiny. Odin rides at the front, leading his fallen warriors. The Ein. Across from him stands Loki, once brother, now betrayer, with the legions of chaos. This is more than a battle. It is a statement that even in the face of inevitable defeat, the Norse spirit does not kneel. Each fight is personal. Thor and the serpent, Odin and the wolf, Loki and Heimdall, two watchmen of different worlds, locked in fatal symmetry. The myth tells us they all fall not because evil triumphs, but because balance demands it. When the giant Surtur raises his flaming sword, the world burns. Land turns to ash. Mountains melt into rivers of fire. The sea boils. This apocalyptic imagery, Iasente, only mythique. Archaeologists believe it may echo memories of volcanic eruptions that darkened skies for years. Perhaps the eruption of Iceland's volcanoes around 536 CE, which plunged Europe into a volcanic winter. The Viking imagination preserved these cataclysms, not as geology, but as prophecy. In the silence after fire, the cirrus whispers. Again. Two humans, Elef and Lifthracer, hide within the trunk of Ig. When the flames subside, they emerge to see a new sunrise. The gods are gone, but life begins anew. For modern eyes, Ragnarok looks like a story of despair, but for the Vikings, it was a promise. To them, every end carried the seed of a beginning. Every sunset held the dawn. That is why even after conversion, Norse people kept the rhythm of Ragnarok alive in art, in runes, in song, because it told them something deeper than any sermon. That courage matters more than certainty. That endings are not defeat, and that even gods must fall for life to continue. In the reborn world, the sons of the slain gods return. Thor's children find their father's hammer. Odin's heirs build new halls. The sun's daughter rises where her mother fell. Life continues, not as a repetition, but as renewal. The Vikings believed that just as the sea swallows and returns the shore, history itself repeats in waves. What dies feeds what comes next. Behind the thunder and flame, Ragnarok is about us, about what it means to live knowing that all things end. The Norse did not seek immortality. They sought memory, honor, legacy. To die bravely, to be remembered in song, that was their eternity. And so, Ragnarok was not a warning to fear death, but a challenge to live fiercely, knowing it waits for all. The world has burned and been reborn. The gods have fallen, but their echoes remain in the stones, the waves, the sky itself. And as the new dawn rises, We turn to the question the Vikings themselves left unanswered. If every cycle ends and begins again, what remains eternal? The fire has passed. The gods have fallen, and in the silence that follows the storm, something stirs beneath the ash, a heartbeat, a whisper, the promise of life renewed. The world awakens. Where mountains once burned, green shoots rise. The rivers, blackened by ash, begin to run clear again. The air smells of salt and rain. Two figures emerge from the shelter of Yggdrasil, Liffy and Liftrazig, the seed of humankind. They do not speak. They simply breathe. Their eyes reflect a sky washed clean by fire. From their steps, the next age begins. This is how the Norse saw the world, not as a straight line from birth to death, but as a great circle. And every ending was just the soil from which new beginnings would bloom. The myth of Ragnarok doesn't end in despair. It ends in renewal, in the quiet resilience of those who remain. That, perhaps, was the truest reflection of the Viking world. They lived in one of Earth's harshest environments, where the sea could betray, the winters could starve, and empires to the south barely knew their names. Yet they endured, not by defying the world, but by understanding it. To the Norse mind, creation and destruction were not enemies. They were partners, like the tide and the moon, the fire and the forge. What bends away makes room for what will grow. Even as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the echoes of the old world lingered. Temples were replaced by churches, but the carvings on their walls still told the same stories. Serpents, wolves, and world trees. The Vikings did not abandon their past. They transformed it. Ragnarok became a bridge between belief systems, a language both pagan and Christian could understand, because both faiths spoke of an end and of a beginning. In the sagas written centuries later, you can still feel the tension, not between right and wrong, but between memory and change. When the flames of Ragnarok die down, several gods rise again. Baldur, the beloved, returns from hell, a symbol of innocence restored. Viar and Vali, sons of Odin, survived the battle. Mor, and Magni, sons of Thor, inherit their father's hammer. This is not resurrection, it is inheritance. It reflects a belief older than any scripture, that what we build in life continues through those who remember. To the Vikings, memory was sacred. They said a man dies 3 times, once when his body falls, once when his name is spoken for the last time, and once when his deeds are forgotten. Ragnarok ensures the second and third deaths never come, because even after the gods fall, their stories keep them alive. Liffy and Liftrazig, the 2 survivors of humankind, are more than characters. They are metaphors. They represent persistence, the unbroken thread of humanity. To live after the end of the world is to begin again without fear, to rebuild without gods, without certainty, but with the memory of what was lost. For the Norse, this wasn't fantasy. It was instruction. They knew life after catastrophe, after long winters, after shipwrecks, after invasions. Ragnarok wasn't a distant myth. It was a reflection of their own endurance. From the ashes of the old sun rises its daughter, a new light. In the myth, this symbolizes rebirth, but to the Norse, it also spoke of the cycles of nature they saw each year. The long darkness of winter always gave way to the return of spring. Death always yielded to life. That rhythm became the foundation of their faith and of their storytelling. The Vikings didn't write their myths to predict the future. They wrote them to make peace with it, to understand that everything, even the sun, must die before it can rise again. Centuries after the last Viking longship sailed, the story of Ragnarok continued to echo through art, literature, and music. It whispered through medieval Icelandic poetry. It thundered through Wagner's operas. It glowed in the ink of Tolkien's legends. And today, it lives in us. In every story of rebirth, in every hero who falls so that others may rise, because Ragnarok is not only Norse, it is human. It is the story of how we face the inevitable and find meaning within it. Archaeologists have found carvings on Viking burial stones that show scenes from Ragnarok. Odin, swallowed by the wolf, the serpent rising from the sea. But around those images are symbols of fertility, of crops, of rebirth, even in death. They carved renewal. They believed no grave was final. Every burial mound was a bridge between what was lost and what might come again. This is why, when Christianity took hold, it didn't erase the old stories, it absorbed them. Saints took on the courage of warriors. Angels bore the thunder of Thor. The apocalypse of the Book of Revelation found its mirror in the twilight of the gods. For us, the end of the world is often something to fear, a collapse, a loss, an extinction. For the Vikings, it was something to accept. They didn't fight fate because they expected to win. They fought because that was their purpose. That is the quiet power at the heart of Ragnarok. To act with honor even when the outcome is certain. To stand firm not because it saves you, but because it defines you. In that sense, Ragnarok is less about gods and more about being human. To endure with dignity, to face loss with courage, to believe that every fire can kindle new life. The reborn world of the Norse is not paradise. It is not perfect, nor eternal. It is simply alive. That is, in Og, grass grows again. The sea breathes. The air hums with renewal. The sons of gods and the children of men walk together across the green plain. There are no temples, no crowns, only memory and promise. This is the truest legacy of the Viking spirit, that no matter what burns, something always rises from the smoke. Over 1,000 years have passed since the last skald sang of wreck, but the rhythm remains in language, in art, in how we speak of endings. When we rebuild after loss, when we find hope in ruin, we repeat their story. For the Norse, storytelling was the lifeblood of immortality. As long as the tale is told, the world still turns. In the end, the seeress who foretold Ragnarok fades into the silence she predicted, but her words linger like smoke. From the ashes, life shall grow again. From the fallen, courage shall rise, and from silence, song shall return. Perhaps that was her truest prophecy, not of gods dying, but of stories living on. When we look back on the Viking Age, we often see warriors, raiders, and explorers. But beneath the steel and storms lay philosophers, people who accepted impermanence and found peace in the rhythm of destruction and renewal. Ragnarok in their eyes was not tragedy. It was truth. To live fully. To die bravely. To rise again through those who remember you. That was immortality. And so, from the embers of the old world, a new story begins. The gods may have fallen, but their echoes shape us still. Every sunrise carries a fragment of that ancient fire. The courage to begin again. In the next chapter, Ragnar't, the end and rebirth of the Viking world. We explore how myth became memory, how belief transformed into legacy, and how the idea of an ending became the heartbeat of a culture that refused to fade.